AITA for not paying anything for college for my GF's daughter when I could afford to pay it all? Life as a single father of twins wasn't what I'd imagined when my kids were young. But it's the life I've built. And I wouldn't trade it. My daughter and son, both 17 now, have been my world since they were born. And raising them alone has defined much of who I am. Their mom hasn't been in the picture for a long time. She left our lives when they were 5. Disappearing with little explanation and no plans to return. Since then, it's been the 3 of us against the world. While their mom's parents are out there somewhere. They've stayed far from our lives too. And I've accepted that I'd be the one to provide for my kids on my own terms. It's hard to imagine now. But 3 years ago, life threw a curveball I never saw coming. During my twins' freshman orientation, a parent introduced herself, a warm, friendly woman named Laura who, to my surprise, didn't waste any time asking me to coffee. I was flattered but cautious. Dating wasn't exactly on my radar. Between work, budgeting, and keeping my kids on track, there wasn't a lot of room for romance. Still, something about her was refreshing, and I decided to give it a shot. That coffee date turned into several, and before I knew it, we were in a committed relationship. Laura has a daughter, Allison, who's also 17 and goes to the same school as my twins. Allison is a sweet girl, though I never felt particularly close to her. In many ways, her life was completely different from ours. She lived primarily with her father, who had plenty of money and covered her education expenses and more without a second thought. Her dad's wealth meant that she went through life with opportunities that my kids and I could only imagine. Though that's not to say I resented her for it. It just made it easier for me to keep a bit of distance. Through all these years of single parenting, I've kept one goal in mind: to give my kids a stable future. I've saved diligently, putting away money here and there to ensure that when the time came, they could go to college or pursue any path they wanted without being held back financially. It wasn't easy, especially considering that both my kids are attending a private high school on scholarships, an incredible opportunity, but one that comes with its own pressures. Laura knew about my savings plan for my twins from early on in our relationship, and she was always supportive. In fact, the idea of financial independence was something we both seemed to respect. I never imagined that finances would become a point of tension between us, given her own family's situation and her daughter's well-funded lifestyle. But as graduation looms closer, and her ex-husband's financial troubles have made college funding difficult for Allison, it's all change. Her requests to help Allison started out small, casual comments here and there about the future. But they quickly became something more, a request that I wasn't ready to handle. Now I'm left to consider a difficult question. Am I responsible for funding a future that isn't mine? A future that belongs to my girlfriend's daughter? The shift started slowly. Laura's ex-husband, Allison's father, had always been the type to flaunt his wealth, taking Allison on trips, providing her with everything she needed, and making sure her private education was paid for without a second thought. Allison's financial security had always been a given, and I knew that Laura trusted her ex's money to cover all the big expenses in her daughter's life, including college. But last year, Laura's ex-husband's business took a major hit. A civil lawsuit had left him with a sizable financial judgment, something he wasn't able to dodge. From what Laura told me, he'd managed to pull together enough to cover the cost of Allison's senior year. But beyond that, he was stretched thin, leaving no funds for college. It was a blow Laura didn't see coming. And while she tried to stay calm, I could tell the worry was eating at her. Allison's future, which had always felt so secure, suddenly looked precarious. Then came an unexpected twist. My kids' maternal grandparents reached out to me. They're well off, but our relationship has been non-existent. They had disowned their daughter, my kid's mother, years ago because we had our children out of wedlock. I'd always sensed another underlying reason, too, something unspoken. I'm black, and their daughter chose me, a choice they've always seemed to resent, even if they never outright said it. Despite years of silence, my ex's parents offered a considerable sum to help with my twins' education, money they'd quietly saved for their grandchildren. Untouched and waiting all these years, they offered me half of it, enough to fund my kids' college dreams and more. There was, however, a condition attached to the other half. My children would have to forge a relationship with them to receive it. I accepted the first half on my children's behalf and left the decision about a relationship up to them. Whether they choose to reach out to their grandparents is entirely in their hands. The money is there if they need it. But I won't push them. My focus has always been on giving them options. And this unexpected windfall only adds to their ability to pursue their future without financial worry. But as Laura learned of the funds, a new tension emerged. At first, she seemed pleased for me, understanding how much security this would bring to my kids' lives. Yet soon enough, her tone shifted, and the hints started. Little comments about how lucky my children were to have their college paid for and how unfortunate it was that Allison wouldn't have that same chance now that her dad's financial situation had changed. It wasn't long before she came right out with it, asking if I'd be willing to use some of the extra money to help Allison with her college expenses. She framed it as a reasonable suggestion, pointing out that my twins could still access additional funds if they formed a relationship with their grandparents. "It's not like you'll need all of it right away," she said, her words floating between casual and expectant. "Allison could really use the help. And you can't deny that you're in a position to make a difference." I was taken aback. The extra money was, in my mind, a future safety net for my twins. College, grad school, a first home, maybe even the seed money for a business if that's where life took them. This was their foundation. Something I dreamed of providing since the moment I became a single dad. My priority was, and still is, my children's future, a future that had always been my sole responsibility to plan and protect. Yet Laura seemed to believe that because I had more than I'd originally saved, I could afford to share some of it with her daughter. I told her as gently as I could that my plan was to keep the funds set aside solely for my kids. To which she reacted with visible disappointment. She seemed to think it was unfair, even selfish, given that I was in a position to give Allison the same opportunities. But to me, this wasn't about fairness or even generosity. It was about honoring years of sacrifice, planning, and the promise I'd made to my kids to secure their futures. Now, with Laura's request lingering in the air, I'm left wondering if this decision is as clear-cut as I thought it was. She insists I could easily make Allison's college dream a reality, but I can't shake the feeling that doing so would come at the cost of my own kids' dreams. Laura's request weighed heavily on me, and in trying to make sense of it, I found myself looking back over the years, revisiting all the reasons I'd worked so hard to provide for my twins. Being a single parent hadn't come easy. It had been a journey built on a mix of determination, sacrifice, and a commitment to making sure my kids never lacked the stability I'd missed out on as a child. For so long, I'd operated with a clear purpose: to give my kids the best start I could afford. Even if it meant foregoing luxuries, cutting corners, and saying no to myself more often than I cared to admit. The truth was, saving for my children's future had been more than a financial goal, it had been a mission. Knowing that college could be a possibility for them, even though we lived modestly, had given me a sense of pride and purpose. My twins had earned scholarships to attend their private high school, a prestigious place far out of our financial reach otherwise, and I'd been prepared to do whatever it took to see them through to college as well. The idea that I was suddenly expected to support someone else's child, a child I cared for, yes, but who had two parents of her own, felt like a challenge to that very purpose. Adding to the complexity was my ex's parents' sudden involvement. The grandparents had always stayed distant, choosing to cut ties with their daughter and, by extension, her children, because of choices they didn't agree with. They were devout Mormons, and my kids were born outside of marriage. A reality that strained their views on family loyalty and tradition. And while they'd never said it outright, I always had a nagging feeling that their prejudice toward me, toward my race, played a role in their decision to keep their distance. When they reached out to me, offering a substantial sum for my kids' education, it stirred up a lot of old emotions: hurt, resentment, gratitude, all mixed together. Here they were, presenting me with an incredible opportunity for my kids, one that could change the entire trajectory of their lives. But they were offering it conditionally. Half of the money was freely given, and the other half would only be accessible if my twins built a relationship with them. The idea of such a transactional offer rubbed me the wrong way. But I accepted it on behalf of my kids, letting them decide for themselves if they wanted to meet their grandparents' terms. Laura knew about this arrangement, and while she sympathized with my mixed feelings about the whole situation, I sensed she saw it differently. In her mind, this was just another source of funds my kids could access if they wanted to. And that extra money should be fair game to help out her daughter. But to me, it wasn't that simple. This money represented security, something that hadn't come easily in our lives. My ex's parents' conditional offer, while generous, came with an emotional toll. And I wasn't about to let that gift be spent outside the original intent of supporting my own children. As I saw it, Laura's daughter had two active, present parents. Even if her father's financial stability had taken a hit, she had access to her dad and the resources he could try to pull together. Even if it meant he had to adjust his lifestyle or seek scholarships and financial aid. Allison had options, avenues to explore that didn't involve me stepping in to bear that financial responsibility. My twins, on the other hand, had only me. The conversations with Laura were becoming harder to navigate, and her accusations started to sting. She'd begun framing my decision as unfair, and implied that my kids were set up more than enough, while Allison was being left behind through no fault of her own. I started to question my stance, wondering if I was being stubborn or somehow failing to empathize with her position. But each time I reflected on it, I kept coming back to the same thought. This wasn't about a lack of generosity. It was about honoring the obligations I'd carried for years. My role as a parent was to protect and provide for my children first and foremost. They hadn't had the financial support of their mother or grandparents for most of their lives. And now, with college on the horizon, I finally had a way to give them a solid start. Even with this new financial cushion, I knew the future was unpredictable. What if one of them wanted to pursue grad school? What if they needed help buying a home or starting a business? This money wasn't just for college, it was the foundation for whatever dreams they wanted to chase. But as Laura continued to press, I found myself struggling to articulate these thoughts without sounding defensive. She saw my unwillingness to help Allison as a lack of commitment to her family. As if my refusal to pay for her daughter's college meant I didn't care for them as a unit. I wanted to be sensitive to her fears, to the changes her family was going through. But at the same time, I needed her to understand that my obligations and loyalty to my kids came first. This wasn't a question of generosity or fairness. It was about maintaining the stability I'd worked so hard to build and honoring the promises I'd made to my children. Laura's hints quickly grew into more pointed conversations, each one edging closer to outright demands. What had started as light comments about helping where I could turned into arguments that left us both feeling hurt and defensive. I'd never expected her to react this way, and every confrontation chipped away at the trust we'd built over the years. She seemed convinced that I was intentionally neglecting Allison's needs, framing my reluctance as a personal affront to her and her daughter. I began to dread the moments when college planning would come up. It seemed like every discussion spiraled into the same accusations. Laura would tell me I was being selfish, that I was letting my kids hoard funds they didn't even need right now, while Allison's entire future was hanging in the balance. "Your twins are so lucky," she'd say, a bitterness in her voice that stung. "They're going to be just fine. But Allison's future is at risk, and you have the means to make it secure." The logic sounded simple enough, but her words felt like a trap. If I agreed, I'd be sacrificing a portion of the money I'd worked so hard to secure for my twins' future. If I refused, I'd continue to be cast as the villain, painted as a selfish, unyielding barrier to Allison's dreams. In Laura's eyes, my hesitation wasn't about protecting my kids' future. It was about my refusal to embrace her daughter as part of our extended family. One evening, after yet another tense conversation, Laura outright accused me of prioritizing money over love. She couldn't seem to grasp why this decision weighed so heavily on me, or why I wasn't willing to bend. "If you're so sure your kids need this money, then why can't they just reach out to their grandparents for the other half?" she pressed, frustration lacing her tone. "If they want more in the future, they know how to get it." Her argument stung, and I found myself at a loss for words. Laura was suggesting that my twins could simply form a relationship with their estranged grandparents for financial gain. Something that felt morally wrong to me. I told my kids the choice was theirs to make without any pressure. And it wasn't a decision I felt comfortable pushing them into just for the sake of a safety net. I wanted them to have freedom, not a bond based on obligation or convenience. But Laura saw things differently. To her, My unwillingness to help Allison was proof that I valued my children's future luxuries over her daughter's immediate needs. And no matter how much I tried to explain my perspective, she wouldn't, or perhaps couldn't, see it. Every time I attempted to lay out my reasons, the conversation ended in anger and accusations. She'd tell me that I was being cold, that I didn't understand what family meant, and that I was making a huge mistake by refusing to step up for Allison. These conversations left me questioning myself more than I cared to admit. I found myself lying awake at night, wondering if I was being too rigid, too protective of what I saw as my kids' future security. Was I holding onto my principles at the cost of hurting the people I cared about? Or was this simply a matter of setting necessary boundaries to protect what I'd worked so hard for? Laura's words hung in the back of my mind, stirring up old insecurities about what it meant to be a good partner, a fair person, a responsible father. I'd spent years carrying the weight of responsibility for my children, years telling myself that providing for them was my primary purpose. Now, with Laura's accusations echoing in my head, I started to feel like I was under a microscope, my every move judged as either selfish or selfless based on whether it aligned with her expectations. But even through the guilt and self-doubt, a part of me held firm. I knew I wasn't refusing out of malice or spite. I had deep empathy for Allison's situation and for Laura's fears about her daughter's future. Yet, I couldn't ignore the reality that this money was meant to secure my kids' futures, to fulfill a commitment I'd made to them long ago, back when the road ahead felt uncertain and filled with sacrifices I'd chosen to make for them alone. I loved Laura, and I cared deeply for her, but my children's futures had to come first. Still, as our arguments grew more frequent, I feared the cost of this decision, of this boundary I was unwilling to cross. Laura's mounting disappointment was creating a rift I wasn't sure we could bridge. And with each passing day, I could feel her slipping further away, and as much as I tried to stay true to my principles, the strain was taking a toll on me, leaving me torn between loyalty to my kids and the pressure to meet someone else's expectations of family. In the midst of this mounting tension, I found myself going back to the reason I'd saved so diligently all these years, to give my children the life and opportunities I never had. For as long as I can remember, my goal was simple: to create a future for my twins that was secure. One that would allow them to pursue their dreams without the shadow of financial stress. This money was more than a fund for college, it was a foundation that would support them far beyond their undergraduate years. I began to picture what their futures might hold. My daughter had been talking about studying psychology and potentially going on to grad school. The prospect was thrilling but came with a hefty price tag, and the added funds from her grandparents could help her take that path without being weighed down by student debt. My son, meanwhile, had shown an entrepreneurial spark, often talking about starting a business one day. He was young, but I could see the passion in him, a drive I wanted to nurture without the burden of loans and financial constraints holding him back. The options that lay ahead for them were as varied as they were exciting: perhaps a first home, a startup fund, or a chance to explore the world before settling into their careers. Having this financial cushion didn't just mean college for them, it meant choices. I wanted them to enter adulthood with the freedom to make decisions based on passion and potential, not limited by financial restrictions. This wasn't something I took lightly, it was the promise I'd made to myself and to them from the start. When Laura suggested that my twins could rely on additional funds from their grandparents, the thought didn't sit well with me. The grandparents had made their conditions clear. Only if my children fostered a relationship with them would they receive the rest of the money. I told my kids they were under no obligation to comply. Forcing that relationship, just to tap into extra money, felt wrong to me. I wanted my kids to decide if they wanted that bond based on something real, not because they needed financial support. The choice to accept or decline that relationship was theirs alone, and that autonomy mattered more than any dollar amount. Laura's insistence that this extra financial security wasn't truly needed made me uneasy. She saw it as an excess, something we could spare without much impact. But she hadn't lived the same struggles we had. I had been the sole provider, the one budgeting down to the last dollar, wondering if I could ever give my kids more than just the basics. This windfall wasn't extra to me, it was hard-earned peace of mind. A way to shield my children from the scarcity that had defined so many of our early years together. I couldn't help but feel that Laura's view of money was shaped by her different circumstances. Allison had always been supported by her wealthy father. And it was only now, with his financial troubles, that they were experiencing the uncertainty my kids and I had known for years. I had empathy for Allison. I truly did, but I couldn't shake the conviction that my duty was to my children first. This wasn't about withholding help, it was about protecting what I'd built for my family. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had to stand firm. My twins had their futures ahead of them, and I wanted to be able to support whatever path they chose. Whether they wanted to continue their education, start a business, or pursue any other dream, I knew they'd need a solid foundation to make those choices freely. I'd spent years scraping together every cent, dreaming of a day when I wouldn't have to worry about their security. Now, with this money finally in place, I couldn't justify diverting any of it away. As I weighed everything out, I could see Laura's side more clearly. Even if I didn't agree with it, her daughter's future was no less important than my children's, that much was true. But Allison had two parents, both capable of exploring other options to support her college ambitions. She had resources to pull from, avenues to pursue that my kids didn't. And while it was unfortunate that her dad's financial situation had changed, it didn't mean the burden of her education fell to me. Every parent wants the best for their child, and I understood that Laura was trying to secure Allison's future. But this was about setting boundaries, about understanding where my responsibility ended and hers began, no matter how much she pressed. I couldn't ignore the years of planning and sacrifice that had gone into building this future for my twins. They had been my world for so long, my sole focus and the reason behind every decision I'd made. To divert those funds now, just because I was in a better position, felt like I'd be betraying that promise to them. In my heart, I knew I couldn't compromise on this. This money was meant to support my kids, to provide them with the foundation I dreamed of giving them since the day they were born. They had only me to rely on, and I couldn't let them down. Laura's frustration only grew as the weeks went by, and I could see her patience thinning every time the topic came up. In her mind, my refusal to help Allison felt like a personal betrayal, a rejection of her family and everything she'd envisioned for our future together. She tried to reason with me, telling me that family meant supporting one another when times got tough. That it was a matter of principle. You have the money, so why wouldn't you help if you care about us? She asked. Again and again. To her, my unwillingness to pay for Allison's college was proof that I didn't see her daughter as family. She saw it as a sign that I wasn't fully invested in our relationship. That I was placing money over relationships, over love. It was hard to hear her say that. Knowing how much I cared for her, I did want a future with Laura. But that future didn't automatically extend to sharing the financial plans I'd spent years building for my kids. One of Laura's biggest arguments was that my kids had more than enough money now, especially with the extra funds from their grandparents. To her, that money represented a surplus, a safety net my kids didn't necessarily need right now. She saw my refusal as a form of hoarding, an unwillingness to share that went beyond rational boundaries and ventured into what she called selfishness. She suggested that if my twins needed more money in the future, they could choose to reach out to their grandparents and secure the additional funds. Why can't they just go to their grandparents if they need more? It's there for them if they want it, right? She asked, as if the solution were that simple. But to me, the extra funds weren't something my kids could just pick up like spare change. Forming a relationship with their grandparents would be a personal decision, one that came with its own complications, especially given the history of estrangement. I wanted my twins to make that choice freely, not under the weight of financial pressure. The idea of steering them toward a relationship just to unlock more money felt manipulative, and it wasn't a path I was willing to push them down. Laura's arguments wore on me. She couldn't understand why I was so adamant, and each conversation seemed to drive a deeper wedge between us. From her perspective, my choice was about more than money, it was about loyalty. About whether or not I truly valued her family as part of my own. She believed that if I really cared about her, if I saw us as a unit, then I'd be willing to make sacrifices for Allison the way I would for my own children. Family doesn't hoard resources when someone's struggling, she'd say, her words filled with an edge that hinted at deeper hurt. To Laura, supporting her daughter was a natural extension of our relationship, a way of showing that I was fully invested. She'd mentioned that if the roles were reversed, she'd help my kids in a heartbeat. Without question. And maybe she would, but that wasn't the point to me. I'd spent my entire life building something specific for my children, and the idea of redirecting those funds simply because we were in a relationship felt unreasonable. It was hard to articulate that without sounding defensive, without making it seem like I didn't care for her or her daughter. I knew she was disappointed, but I couldn't force myself to see things her way. My primary obligation had always been to my twins. And while I wanted a future with Laura, I felt that blending finances in this way wasn't right. Her perception of family was different from mine. To her, love and support meant pooling resources, erasing boundaries, and stepping up for one another regardless of the sacrifices involved. But for me, supporting my kids meant protecting the life and stability I'd spent years creating. Even if it meant setting boundaries that felt hard and, yes, perhaps even selfish to some. Laura's perspective opened my eyes to just how different our values around money and family really were. She'd grown up in a comfortable household, one where financial support had always been available in times of need. I, on the other hand, had been raised to fend for myself, to see financial independence as a form of survival. I'd built my life around the belief that you save, plan, and protect what's yours because no one else will do it for you. That approach wasn't just a habit, it was a necessity. One born from years of living without a safety net. Yet, as much as I understood our differing viewpoints, her insistence began to chip away at my patience. The more she pushed, the more I felt backed into a corner. I'd expected support, or at the very least understanding, but instead, I was met with constant pressure and reminders of what I should do if I truly cared about our relationship. And each time she hinted that my refusal reflected a lack of commitment to her. It hurt, leaving me to wonder if we could ever bridge this divide. In the end, I realized that, as much as I loved Laura, I couldn't give in to her expectations. Our views on family support and financial boundaries were simply too different. She saw my refusal as an unwillingness to embrace her daughter. But I knew it was about honoring the responsibilities I'd taken on years before we'd even met. While I understood her perspective, I couldn't compromise my own values, even if it meant risking the future of our relationship. After weeks of arguments, sleepless nights, and questioning every decision I'd made, I knew it was time to make a final call. The endless back and forth had taken its toll, not only on my relationship with Laura but also on my peace of mind. I realized that no amount of debating was going to change how deeply I felt about protecting my kids' future. The funds I had saved were for them, plain and simple, and as much as I wished things could be different, I couldn't ignore the commitment I'd made to my twins all those years ago. But deciding on this course of action wasn't easy. I spent hours thinking about the life I wanted to build with Laura and how this decision could impact that. I loved her, and the idea of supporting Allison tugged at me, but each time I circled back to the thought, I couldn't bring myself to shift those hard-earned funds toward a responsibility that wasn't mine. My duty was to my children, and I knew that if I caved now, I'd regret it later. The guilt of letting my kids down in favor of someone else's expectations wasn't something I was willing to live with. Reflecting on the years I'd spent saving for my children's future solidified my stance. I remembered the countless sacrifices I'd made, all those moments of doubt and stress when I wasn't sure I'd be able to provide the stability I wanted for them. I hadn't built these savings by accident, they were the result of years of careful planning and dedication. And while I knew Laura cared deeply for her daughter's future, that didn't change the fact that Allison had two parents to lean on for support. My kids had only me. So, I decided to sit Laura down and tell her, calmly and clearly, where I stood. I didn't want to dodge this decision or leave room for misunderstandings, it was too important. I told her that while I deeply cared for her and Allison, I couldn't, in good conscience, divert my kids' savings. They were at the precipice of adulthood, with dreams and goals that I'd worked tirelessly to support. To take away from that now felt wrong, no matter how I tried to look at it. She listened, though I could see the disappointment settle on her face as I spoke. I told her that I respected her desire to support Allison and that I admired her commitment to her daughter's future. But I emphasized that this decision was about staying true to my role as a father to my own children. A role that demanded I put them first. My commitment to Laura didn't change that. And I needed her to understand that my priorities were rooted in years of responsibility and sacrifice. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. I could see she was holding back her emotions. And a part of me ached, knowing how much this hurt her. But I couldn't let her disappointment sway me. I had made my choice. And while I knew it might alter the course of our relationship, I felt a sense of peace in finally putting my foot down. I wasn't going to waver or leave this unresolved. By setting this boundary, I was reclaiming a sense of control over my family's future. A future that Laura's expectations had blurred for far too long. I had tried to empathize, to understand her side, but ultimately, I knew I was making the right choice for me and my kids. This wasn't about withholding or denying, it was about honoring the foundation I'd worked so hard to build for my children. With the decision made, I felt the weight lift. Though I knew the road ahead with Laura would be complicated, I was prepared for that. I had reaffirmed my role as a father, my commitment to my twins, and the responsibility I felt toward their future. For better or worse, I had chosen my path. And for the first time in weeks, I felt steady, resolved, and ready to face whatever might come next. When I finally made my decision known to Laura, I could see the hurt in her eyes as the realization settled in. There was no outburst, no immediate accusations, just a heavy silence that hung between us. Thick with unspoken disappointment, she looked at me as though she was seeing a side of me she'd never expected. And in that moment, I knew that this choice might change our relationship forever. Over the following days, the atmosphere between us grew colder, and the quiet was filled with a tension I couldn't break. Laura was polite, but her words came clipped, and there was a distance in her gaze that hadn't been there before. I could feel her pulling away, even as we tried to maintain the normalcy of our routines. It hurt to watch her close off, but I knew there was little I could do to soften the blow. She had wanted something from me that I couldn't give. And now the weight of that refusal was defining the space between us. Laura didn't directly bring up my decision again, but she didn't need to. Her disappointment showed in small ways. She would spend more time alone or with Allison, and in our brief interactions. She kept her tone neutral, almost formal, as if she were speaking to a stranger. Every so often, she would drop a hint about how some people just don't understand family loyalty, and I knew the words were meant for me. A quiet accusation lingering under the surface. In her mind, my refusal to help Allison was proof that I didn't see us as a family unit. And as much as I tried to remind myself that I'd made the right decision, Laura's growing coldness began to chip away at me. It was difficult, watching our once warm relationship transform into something guarded and distant. She seemed to view my boundaries as a rejection, not just of Allison, but of her as well. And I could feel her slowly shutting me out. One night, Laura sat across from me at the dinner table, her eyes fixed on her plate as she finally voiced what she'd been holding back. "I thought we were in this together," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it seems like when it comes down to it, we're not as much of a family as I thought." I took a breath, steadying myself, knowing that no answer I gave would change her feelings. "We are in this together, Laura," I replied, doing my best to keep my tone gentle. "But my kids, our lives together. Everything I've worked for, it's all been built around my commitment to them. This decision doesn't mean I don't care about you or Allison. It just means that I have to honor the promises I made to my kids." She nodded, but I could tell my words did little to ease her disappointment. She stood up, and as she walked away, I was left with an emptiness I hadn't felt before. It was as if we were living in two different worlds now. Separated by expectations neither of us was willing to compromise on. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us only grew. She became more withdrawn, less inclined to engage in the easy conversations we once had. I could feel her resentment growing, a simmering tension that turned simple exchanges into strained efforts at civility. She was civil but detached, as if every word, every glance, was a reminder of the boundary I'd drawn, a boundary that had effectively placed her daughter outside the future I was building for my own children. The hardest part was knowing that she believed my choice reflected a lack of commitment to her. From her perspective, helping Allison would have solidified our bond, a gesture that symbolized a true merging of our lives. But to me, keeping my promise to my kids was a commitment that took precedence over everything else. A reality that Laura seemed unable, or unwilling, to accept. As the weeks went on, I began to realize that this decision had revealed a deeper divide in our relationship. A difference in values that went beyond money or college funding. Laura's reaction forced me to confront the reality that we saw family in fundamentally different ways. For her, family was an all-encompassing unit, one that shared resources and responsibilities without question. For me, family meant honoring the commitments I'd made long before she entered my life. In quieter moments, I'd find myself replaying our arguments, wondering if there had been a way to bridge the gap without compromising my values. But each time, I returned to the same conclusion. I couldn't betray the principles that had shaped my life as a father. The fallout from my decision was painful, but it also felt like a necessary consequence of staying true to the promises I'd made to my children. Living with the distance between us was harder than I'd anticipated, and as much as I missed the warmth and closeness we'd once shared, I felt a sense of peace in knowing that I had done what I believed was right. Laura's disappointment might never fade, and the future of our relationship was uncertain, but I knew, deep down, that this choice was a reflection of my deepest values, the responsibility I held as a father, the promise I'd made to secure my children's future. As I navigated the fallout, I realized that setting boundaries, even with those we love, is sometimes the most necessary act of loyalty to ourselves and to the commitments that define us. And while the path forward felt uncertain, I took comfort in knowing that I had honored those commitments, even at the cost of a relationship that had once meant so much. As days turned into weeks, I found myself coming to terms with the new reality in my relationship with Laura. Our once close bond had become strained, and though it hurt to watch her pull away, there was a clarity in my decision that grounded me. With each passing day, I grew more certain that I'd made the right choice, even as it brought an undeniable sense of loss. The life I'd envisioned with Laura had shifted, but the life I'd spent years building for my children felt more solid than ever. In those quiet moments, I'd reflect on what it meant to be a father, on the promises I'd made to my kids when they were young. I'd always told myself that my primary job was to give them the foundation I never had, to provide stability, opportunity, and the freedom to chase dreams without the weight of financial worry. For years, I'd stayed focused on that mission, building savings with each sacrifice, watching my children grow, and dreaming about the lives they'd lead. This financial security was my commitment to them, a promise that I'd be there to support them, no matter what. Watching the tension unfold with Laura, I realized that my decision had revealed a fundamental truth. My relationship with my kids was the central pillar of my life. I cared deeply for Laura and her daughter, but their expectations around family and finances were different from mine, shaped by a life and experiences separate from my own. For Laura, helping Allison felt like a natural extension of commitment, a blending of our worlds. For me, however, it was a line I couldn't cross without betraying my commitment to my twins. Despite Laura's insistence, I knew that my refusal wasn't about a lack of care. I'd stayed true to the values that had guided me as a parent. In fact, I felt stronger for having set this boundary, for standing firm in the face of her disappointment. It reaffirmed that, above all, my children's futures came first, and protecting that foundation was something I couldn't compromise, even for the sake of love. With each conversation I replayed in my mind, I felt my resolve deepen. I'd listened to Laura's arguments, tried to empathize with her frustrations, and given her side more thought than she might ever realize. But the truth remained. My commitment was to my kids. I had built a life around them, and while I had welcomed Laura and her daughter into our world, that didn't mean sacrificing the foundation I'd spent years creating. Over time, I began to let go of the guilt that Laura's accusations had stirred in me. She'd framed my refusal as selfish, a choice that reflected poorly on my sense of family loyalty. But in my heart, I knew that loyalty to my children was the very thing that guided this decision. Family, to me, meant keeping the promises I'd made to them long before Laura entered my life. It wasn't about sharing resources out of obligation or appeasing someone else's sense of fairness. It was about honoring the responsibility I felt toward my twins and the future they deserved. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I found myself grateful for the clarity that had come from this experience. My children's futures, their dreams, and their well-being were my highest priorities, and I had reaffirmed that commitment not just in words, but in actions. This decision was a reminder of who I was as a father and of the life I wanted to build for my family. One rooted in stability, security, and the freedom to choose their own paths. Though my relationship with Laura now felt uncertain, I knew I'd made the right choice. There was a calmness in knowing I'd held true to my values. That I hadn't let outside pressures sway me from the promises I'd built my life around. Whatever came next, I was prepared to face it with the assurance that I'd done what was best for my kids. And as I looked ahead, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and strength, knowing that I'd provided my children with the foundation they needed to thrive. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace, ready to move forward with a heart anchored in the promises I'd made. And a future that, no matter what, I was proud to stand behind. In the quiet aftermath of my decision, as the dust settled and life began to return to a new kind of normal, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The strain with Laura was still there, a tangible shift in our relationship that neither of us could ignore. But alongside that tension was a deep, abiding peace, an inner calm that came from knowing I had honored the promises I'd made to my children. My commitment to their futures remained unshaken, and that realization brought a strength I hadn't expected. With each day that passed, I grew more certain that this choice, painful as it was, had been the right one. My role as a father had always been clear: to provide, to protect, to pave a path that would give my twins the freedom to chase their dreams without the limitations I'd known growing up. This decision was a natural extension of that role, a way of reaffirming the values I held most dear. Reflecting on everything, I could see that this experience had been more than just a disagreement over money. It had revealed the core differences in how Laura and I viewed family and responsibility. Her definition of family was boundless, inclusive, and driven by a belief in shared resources. Mine was more defined, rooted in the commitments I'd made to my kids and the sacrifices I'd made to secure their future. While both views were valid, this situation made it clear that our perspectives were perhaps too different to reconcile. In some ways, I grieved the future I'd imagined with Laura. There was a part of me that still hoped we might find common ground, a way to move forward without the lingering resentment that had taken hold. But I was also prepared for the reality that this decision might mark a turning point for us. If my commitment to my children's futures was something she couldn't fully accept, then maybe this was the path we were meant to walk, painful as it might be. And yet, despite that sadness, I felt liberated. For the first time in years, I was living my life without compromising the values that had guided me as a parent. This choice had shown me the strength of my own convictions, and it reaffirmed that my priorities were exactly where they needed to be. I'd set a boundary not out of selfishness, but out of love, a love that had driven me from the day my children were born. A love that had guided every decision I'd made for their well-being. As I looked toward the future, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The money I'd saved would be there to support my twins as they stepped into adulthood, giving them the stability I'd long dreamed of providing. And that knowledge brought a quiet joy, a sense of fulfillment that filled the empty spaces left by the strain with Laura. Whatever happened between us, I knew that I had built a life for my children that honored the sacrifices and values that had defined my role as their father. In the end, I was at peace. I had chosen my path with clarity, grounded in the promises I'd made and the love that fueled them. And as I moved forward, I felt ready for whatever came next, confident that I'd given my children the best gift I could, a future built on loyalty, stability, and unwavering support. It was a future I was proud to stand behind, no matter what life brought my way.